And welcome back to the LearnToCode podcast. Today we do have a special episode. You may not know, and I was doing some spring cleaning, cleaning my home. I was basically cleaning my home, and I uncovered a lot of boxes. And some of those boxes contain very old gadgets from far way back in the day. I found out my first podcast studio from Behringer. It's a firewire interface with a Behringer mixer console and my first condenser microphone. We are talking about I bought this in December 2008 as a Christmas gift to myself, and because I wanted to begin doing this podcasting that back at the time was a new thing for me, at least. So I wanted to give it a shot, and I knowing nothing at the time, and let's remember that back in the day, this is 2008, there was very little gear dedicated to podcasts themselves. Podcast was one of these things from the internet. Basically, nobody actually believed that it's going to be a thing in the future. So it's pretty much like a hobby, a very cumbersome way to record yourself speaking or maybe playing some music and publishing yourself on the Apple Podcast app. Back in the day, only Apple Apple was basically the podcast platform. So I consider myself lucky to actually begin dealing with the podcast platform so far in the past. So I uncover my Behringer podcast studio firewire gear. I actually cannot try it. I tried out the console. The mixer console seems to be working. I was able to listen to myself speaking on my condenser microphone from 10 years ago. I think it's 11 years ago maybe. I got nostalgic after uncovering that, and I was basically playing with it and see if I can manage to get it to work. I guess that the audio interface is still working, yet since it's using FireWire 400, which is a dead port that only the Apple platform was used to be. Even the Apple guys abandoned FireWire 400 a long time ago. So it's basically obsolete and practically dead. So if you're watching this on YouTube, please give it a like and click the notification button. That's the little bell. You want to see more of these video podcasts, as I may like to call them. And what you may be looking at the moment on my screen is the manga, is the cover for a comic book called The Manga Guide to Databases. And I bring this up because, well, let me tell you a little story, so to give you some context. At the time when I purchased this podcast studio gear, it was quite expensive at the time, for me at least. And it was around $150 at the time. Considering inflation, I don't know how much that is today. But the truth is that it was quite expensive back in the day. And I actually bought the podcast studio because I thought that I will get an entire package, and that is not only the gear, but maybe some piece of software. It came with a piece of software that I never really used because it didn't do what I wanted to do and that was basically just I wanted to just record my podcast, and with the push of a button on the software, I will be able to publish my podcast to the internet. I know it sounds ridiculous, and I didn't read too much back in the day. So never mind that. I was a very young lad. I got my first job on January 2008, so it's almost my first year after college, and getting my first software development work. I was programming with Delphi at the time. The thing is that as a newcomer to the job market, and as I was basically by the way, I've been telling this in the past, I am a college dropout. So I came out of college and I started working, developing software. Obviously, since I didn't have my education finished, I came out with a lot of deficiencies, which, by the way, now I do know that even if I finish my studies at college, I will still have them, because college don't really teach you what you really need. And well, I digress, I guess. The thing is that I got this passion for talking about the stuff that I really like. And back in the day, I really like to read manga. And manga, if you don't know, is basically these Japanese comics with characters drawn like with the big eyes and very young. I was really fond of I don't remember the name, DNA comics mangas, maybe, I don't remember the name. There was this manga which was called DNA something, and it was basically an harem mangas of sorts, but that doesn't matter. The thing is that back in the day, I'm really fond of playing video games, especially PC games and arcade games. Back in the day, there were these arcade machines where you can play video games there. They still exist, yet back in the day, when the time of most people didn't have internet in their homes, let alone gaming consoles, so a lot of poor people like me would rather spend a couple bucks playing arcade games, fighting games mostly, with my friends nearby my school. And it was a different time back in the day. I was getting my first paycheck for an entire year, so I managed to save some money to maybe not buy a gaming PC back in the day, but I was able to purchase this podcast studio or something. So the first problem that I got wasn't the technical aspect of recording a podcast and publishing it, because as time passes, after a month of having the podcast studio, I was actually able to make some testing recordings, and I faced my first true obstacle, and that was that I was unable to find myself something to talk about. I was suffering from something called how do you call it, imposter syndrome. So I suffered from that a lot back in the day, because obviously I was a college dropout, and even though I managed to get a programmer job doing database applications, I was very ignorant of a lot of the bases that I need to fulfill as I was performing my job. So the front end development side, I got a book for learning how to program using Delphi. So I created my first object-oriented programs doing programming with Delphi, even though I didn't went 100% on the object-oriented side of the thing. I was basically using the Delphi IDE to build these Windows forms, these Windows forms where the end user can basically just input some data, store the data inside a database, query the data from the database, and print some PDF reports, printer reports. So very basic stuff. And I did manage to build interesting programs with the little I learned doing that job. But the truth is that I was lacking of a lot of knowledge. I was lacking about the basic of programming languages. Maybe the syntax wasn't the problem really, because the syntax was basically just if, then, else, switch statements, case statements, maybe functions, which I abused of in the past. I didn't use object methods because the entire object-oriented side of Delphi, I felt like it wasn't necessary at the time. Today, I don't think so, obviously. But back in the day, I was young and stupid, so, and mostly ignorant, so that was a thing. I love playing video games, I love reading manga, and after a year of working with database applications and building database applications, I came to the realization that I was lacking on the basics. So I decided to look for help, and my co-workers sadly were more lost than me. It was a mess. I've been talking about this, about them in the past on my previous episodes on the podcast. But the truth is that I was basically alone. I didn't have a mentor, and I still don't have one in person yet. I've been adopting these mentors through time, and they don't even know that they are my mentors, because I am mentoring myself by using their knowledge via their documents. In this case, a manga comic book, and books and video courses. So I've been teaching myself with books and video courses and whatnot. And then it comes December 1st. I've been having around a couple of days with my I think a month maybe. I don't remember very well, it was so long ago. I got some time testing my podcast studio, and I just failed to find a subject to talk about, to dedicate a podcast. So I was lacking on the database side, and at the same time, I managed to get my hands on this manga guide to databases. This was released on, I think, on December 2008. And back in the day, I was looking at Google about books about databases and the basics of databases. And when this comic book came out, that very same year, it was very popular at the time. It seems pretty dumb to basically learn something so serious as databases from a manga book. So, and I didn't pay too much attention to it. I began reading it because I really liked manga at the time. I don't read manga today, maybe because I rather spend my time playing other kinds of video games and reading other materials, pretty much like real books, by the way. And uncovering my podcast studio gear today, all these memories that I seem to have forgotten came to light in my brain. And I was curious about seeing what has been of this book. And it seems like it has aged very well. Databases haven't changed too much. The book is written by Mana Takahashi and Shoko Asuma from the Trend Pro Corporation. So it's already 11 years old, I believe, maybe 10 years old. and it's my favorite book, maybe because of the nostalgia factor. But this was my first introduction to actual database programming and how to actually use databases. Is perfect for a beginner because it covers all the basics for database usage and programming. It doesn't delve into stored functions and stored procedures, but you don't really need to if you are just starting out with them. So, what this book is about? Well, basically, it covers the story of a princess, I don't remember the name, which is led by herself to tend to the kingdom businesses. So, what does that mean? Well, her parents, the king and the queen, decided to go into a vacation, I think. They basically leave her alone by herself to be able to manage the kingdom, and she's doing some management work here and there, and she's facing some serious problems regarding the prices of certain fruits, I believe, that the kingdom tends to produce and sell. It's a very interesting story in the sense that you can actually feel her pain from the standpoint of a person that is actually trying to do a job, and she just cannot bear to stand how the current system is basically too inefficient to work properly. So let me see. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can see that the art is really it's really appealing. It's a manga, and don't ask me why, but on this medieval fantasy kingdom, they do have laptops. I don't know why. So as you can see here, well, if you are listening, I'm basically just trying to remember the actual comic. I'm going to buy this and read it again because I believe that even though the basics, I think that the basics are very well deserving to read again, I guess. It's a very interesting story. So far, the king and the queen decide to go out, travel around the world, and their daughter, the princess, is in charge of the kingdom businesses. And the introduction of the fifth chapter is basically the princess trying to solve the management problems of the kingdom. And she's facing a problem. For example, I believe that she was selling some fruit, and there were 3 different departments which needed to have the price of some fruit, maybe, and the prices were updated manually on different files. So synchronizing the data among those files was very hard and very prone to mistakes and errors, and very hard to fix them, because you basically need to send someone in person to these physical departments and order the prices to change. So I know it's very weird. It's a manga. I'm used to see even weirder things in mangas anyway. The interesting part of this comic book, of this manga, is that you are basically led into believing that you are reading a manga story. In reality, you are identifying more and more as the time passes as the princess, she's actually learning about databases and applying the knowledge to build this database to manage the kingdom data. Let's see the table of contents here, and the first chapter is called "What is a database?" And here we are explaining. They explain to us, well, why do we need databases? And I remember talking about this yesterday on my previous episode. It's being covered here in an easier way to understand, may I say, because obviously this is all prepared, this is all reduced into simple phrases. This is not a book, so you are not getting entire paragraphs in every single page. You are lucky if you are actually reading a paragraph per page. So there is not too much text. The visuals aid you, and if I recall, at the end of every chapter, there is a summary that teaches you or remembers, you can basically read the summary, and you are going to actually see what the author is trying to tell you in a more book-like format. So the second chapter is trying to explain what is a relational database. So a database and a relational database are not the same thing yet. On today's industry, we basically understand that a database is most of the time a relational database. A relational database is basically a database where you have your data inside tables, and these tables are representing entities on the real world. These entities have relationships among other entities on your business. So it's your task to find these relationships between these entities and represent them and represent these relationships on a database model. So they explain what is a relational database. We are introduced to some database terms. We are explaining what are relational databases. I do see here types of data models. I don't remember this really. I need to read this again. And the third chapter reads, let's design a database. This was one of the hardest chapters for me to actually get through. I do remember reading this chapter more than once, maybe 3 times or more. I am introduced formally to the entity relationship model. And here is when I actually get that this manga, it has to be taken seriously. Everything was from chapter 1 and chapter 2. Most of this is basically just terminology. Some things, some terminology I already knew. So I was very relaxed at the first couple of chapters. Starting chapter 3, I began to realize where my knowledge about databases was really lacking, and starting to understand the entity relationship model, what really is, opened my eyes to it basically, this chapter opened my eyes to my own ignorance, because I didn't know how lost I was really on databases. I actually believe that when I got this book, I actually believe that I was just going to have a good time, to read it once, and everything was going to be just fun and games, because it's a manga guide to databases. I was basically going to have a good time reading a manga. And that wasn't really the case. Well, I did have a blast reading the manga. The plot was really interesting. I felt really identified with the princess. And I believe that every single database administrator reading this manga is going to identify with her. And there are some other characters. There is I think it was a male prince, a blonde male prince, which is basically trying to make the princess fall in love with him. And she's just too focused on on solving the problems with the database. That she isn't ignoring him. She already knows that the prince is trying to make her fall in love with him. And even though she's knowing that, her focus on the database is so hard that she just doesn't have the time to deal with that at the moment. And she's basically just ignoring him, setting the prince aside. There is another male character, which is basically her assistant. This is a commoner, and I don't remember the name of the guy, but he's basically not very well versed on the database, just like herself. They both begin the quest for learning about databases at the same point. Yet, since it's the princess, the person that actually has the pressure to solve the problem, it's basically her and her drive, which makes her to actually understand the databases. So chapter 3 opened my eyes. I am starting to get my feet wet with the entity relationship model, and something that I listened on college a couple of times, but no teacher was actually able to explain properly to me, at least, or in class. They were basically just reading from a book description what normalization is. So what is normalization? And this chapter begins touching normalization. And when I was in college, I didn't really understand what normalization was, because my teacher didn't understand what was it. So my teacher didn't understand. He didn't tell us that he didn't understand what normalization really means. So what happened is that, do you understand what normalization is? Yes, I do. And I'm not going to ask the teacher, because I'm supposed to already know, and the teacher already knows, even though he didn't really know. So, normalization is a process that allows you to remove repeated data and on your tables. That was what I was actually understanding from this manga. Obviously, normalization came from a white paper a long time ago, and the process is being described by Mr. Cobb, the actual creator of the entity relationship model. And I think that he is a mathematician, maybe, I don't remember really. And the normalization process, thanks to this book, to this manga, I learned the first normal form, which is the first step into the normalization process. And you need to complete the previous step to be able to start with the next step. So we have these normal forms, and you are fulfilling the rules of every normal form to be able to advance to the next. So I'm getting through the first normal form, the second normal form, and the third normal form. When I read the original white paper about the entity relationship model, I learned that there were actually 7 normalization rules, and I only applied 3 of them. I only studied until the third normal form. So normalization is a very complex subject, and even with the 3 steps of the normalization process, I was able to basically do magic with databases. I cannot imagine if I was able to manage all the levels of normalization. Who knows, maybe. I don't think that it will be practical for me, because a lot of mathematicians are basically so focused on the theory that they get lost. They never really practice or apply into a practical terms the knowledge. And I was more of a pragmatic man back in the day, and today too. So, on chapter 3, I begin reading about the entity relationship model, what is normalization, and relationships between tables. The one-to-one relationship, the one-to-many relationship, and the many-to-many relationship. I'm going to be writing a review for this. This is what you are watching this. If you are watching this on YouTube, this is my first video podcast. I'm going to publish this episode on my regular podcasting channel, I guess, if you can call it that. I'm going to be publishing this on my podcast, and at the same time, I want to share this on YouTube. So, yet I'm planning to actually do an actual review of this manga book. Why? Because I really love this manga in particular. This was the first manga that actually teach me something useful. And I do have a lot of, how do you call it? Nostalgia value assigned to it. So I may like to actually write down a script and review this manga book properly in a shorter YouTube video. So I'm getting introduced to 3 important concepts here on the chapter 3, on the entity relationship model, normalization, and relationships between tables. And obviously, this seems to be like too much for a single chapter. The truth is that as we continue reading the manga, we are applying the knowledge on this very chapter to all the steps below. So chapter 4, it's let's learn about SQL. And here is where the manga is actually introducing you to the practical side of databases, the actual use of the SQL language, which is not a programming language, mind you. It's a query language. So chapter 4 is actually using practical SQL code, and this is code, it's not really programming. So you are actually writing code when you are using SQL, and you are doing the basics, you know, searching for data using the select statement. Here, immediately, and now I'm actually remembering, back in the day, I did have a lot of problems querying data from several tables at the same time. And on this chapter, I really fell in love with the manga. Why? Because this manga book actually teaches me how to do join statements properly. It's the first time that I am actually learning something that my colleagues at work with 10 years or more of experience don't even know how to do. What happens when we need to query data from several tables? One person told me that he basically makes different select statements and save the data into RAM and then use that data as needed. Another person basically teached me how to do the join mechanic only using where statements with several tables at the same time. And as the number of tables increased involved in the query, the amount of code of that thing grows exponentially. It was something horrible, really. So the join statement, really useful. I was able to build join statement with several tables at the same time. It was amazing. This chapter, this subject, the joining of tables, it has to be one of the most important things, if not the most important thing on databases. Querying several data from several different tables, and obviously these tables are related to each other in some way. And in this case, foreign key relationships, which we are seeing on chapter 3, on the previous chapter. I am told how to write down where clauses, creating conditions, how to use the logical operators, comparison operators, searchers, patterns, and how to basically search for strings inside the database. Aggregate functions, and here is something very important too. When you are using aggregate functions, you need to group data by a field. So I start seeing how select statements are not so easy to understand really. And by the uses, I am starting to understand that databases are something more than Excel spreadsheets that are cumbersome to use, are harder to use. That's not the reality. Aggregate functions open a door that I didn't even know it existed. It was an amazing discovery at the time. I am able to search for data and create subqueries that at the same time and combined with other queries allow me to create very complex queries. It's something really amazing. The chapter 3 and chapter 4 seem to be the most important chapters to me for what I can recall. Joining tables is addressed again. Creating a table, the basic syntax to creating a table structure and inserting rows inside the table. How to create a view, which is basically a reusable query. And these reusable queries are stored inside the database engine. So you can basically create selects and use these views as new tables. And the truth is that these new quote-unquote tables are basically just another query. Yet you can actually query those views as they were tables themselves, opening a lot of opportunities there. For example, if you are creating a query to check the cells the cells of certain people on a certain time frame. Let's say you want to know how many the entire cell amount of all your salesmen on a given month. You can do that and store the actual select statement as a view, and then you can recall, you can create a new select statement using that view as a table, and then you can basically save a lot of writing. Chapter 5 is called Let's Operate a Database. And this is where things are getting out of hand for me at the time. I began learning about things that I didn't really know that existed on the database side. And the first thing was transactions. And transactions are one of those tools that I have at this time I haven't seen on any other project I've been involved with. I've been working on database administration for the past 10 years at least. I am on year number 11 now. And it's hard to believe that there are not many projects that are using transaction. And what is a transaction in the database context? Well, basically, if you're inserting data or updating data or deleting data on several tables, and all of these changes are related to each other. For example, the classic example is the the problem that gave this functionality its name, a transaction, a financial transaction. What happens if you go to a bank and your wife go to a bank at the same time, and you both have access to the same account with $100 in it? What happens if you are trying to pull out $80 and your wife is trying to pull out to withdraw $50? So since you cannot do this, let's assume that you are doing this at the very same time, at the exact same time. So if you are not using transactions on your database and you're doing this at the same time, you are going to validate that you have $100. And if this is happening at the same time, then both people are going to be able to pull out the money. So you have $100 on the bank, and two people, one gets $80 and another one gets $50. So you are pulling from $100 account, and you are pulling what, $140 maybe. I'm very bad with math, as you can see. So if you are not using transactions on your database, problems like this are going to be happening all the time, especially if you are getting a lot of transactions on different places affecting related data at the same time. So what are transactions? Transactions are basically blocks of SQL statements, which are basically insert, deletes, and updates. And they are all managed between as a single operation. If they are inside a transaction, all the operations count as a single unit. If one of the steps fails, the entire unit, the entire transaction rolls back, and all the changes on previous tables are reverted back to the original state. What does this mean? Well, basically, if you are using transactions on this very same example, when I try to withdraw $80 and my wife tries to withdraw $50, both operations get into a transaction block, and the $80 are successfully withdrawn, yet the next operation only have access to $20. And when you try to withdraw $50, that's going to fail because you don't have enough funds to withdraw $50. So since the last operation failed, the previous one is going to be canceled and is going to be reverted. So neither you or your wife are going to be able to withdraw money. At least not at the same time, at the very same time, which is oddly happens in databases more than you may think. So that's another great teaching here. What is a transaction? What is a log? Which is basically what I just described here. Database security, I don't remember what this was about. Speeding things up with indexing. Indexes are one of the things that are very confused. I was very confused by them, and I believe that index in databases was the same thing as key fields, and that's not at all what it is. Disaster recovery, I don't remember this very well. Properties of transactions. Well, this is basically the properties of what a transaction is. Basically, all the features that transactions are providing you. Wonderful chapter. Optimizing a query, a nested loop, a sort merge. I don't remember this actually. Optimizing a query. I don't remember this. I need to read this again. Chapter 6, and I think it's the last chapter. is databases are everywhere. Here, I was basically reaffirming something that I already knew. And in this chapter, you are seeing what to do next after reading this manga book. So that's how I will resume this chapter here. Database in use, databases and the web. And back in the day, and we are talking about 10 years ago, websites like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube didn't really exist yet. I was not even WhatsApp or phones. I don't remember. Did the iPhone already exist back in the day, in 2008? I think so, maybe. If it existed, it should be a new thing back in the day. And here is where I'm touching something called stored procedures and triggers. Stored procedures and triggers, and may I add stored functions, depending on your database engine. These are basically little programs that you code using SQL. And why I call them programs? Because that's what they actually are. When I was designing and programming database applications back in the day, all the business logic and all the data validation was done on the desktop app, on the side of the desktop app, on Delphi. I was programming using Objective-Pascal back in the day. So all data validation was done on that side. When I read this chapter here, I began obsessing over this stored procedures thing and triggers, and I learned a lot. And this alone reduced the code that I already have on my desktop app for around 90%. And why is this? Because inserting data into the database, validating the data, getting back data, all of these things were actually on the database engine side. So a lot of that code was now belonging into my into the database. And at the time, I didn't see it yet. After 2 years of developing this project back in the day, Programa Operativo Anual, it was called back. It's still used today, 11 years after. I hardly believe it. This project is making an obsessive use of stored procedures and triggers. I am basically using triggers to detect from a task table which I created. So what is this task table does? Well, basically, it's a table, and when I insert a row inside that table, I read the data of the row and decide what to do. So a lot of people inserted tasks into this table, and the database read the required process on this table and reacted thanks to triggers. And what is a trigger? Well, basically, a trigger is some kind of stored procedure that runs whenever you specify, when you insert into a table, when you update a table, or when you delete a row on a table. So I made several triggers. When inserting a row on the task table, I will execute the main trigger, which reads the data on the row, and depending on what data is on the row is what process I'm going to do. So I was using stored procedures a lot on my last project there, and triggers, obviously. I don't recommend doing that. I did that because at the time I believed that was a pretty good idea, And now I guess that there are better tools to do that. Databases on the web using storage procedures question. What is a distributed database? Horizontal distribution and vertical distribution. I didn't apply this because I was basically using a single server with a single database. Partitioning data, I don't remember what this is. Horizontal partitioning, vertical partitioning. I don't even know what this is referring to. I may have an idea, but I don't think is a thing. Preventing inconsistencies with two-phase commit. I don't remember what that is. Database replication. Replication enabled for all servers. Further application of databases. XML and object-oriented databases. I need to read this again. I see that there is a single page, so I guess that I'm not going to learn too much about XML on a single page on a manga book from 10 years ago, especially because I am working on an XML project myself for digital invoices that are actually required by law by the government in Mexico. So I'm going to be working with XML. I'm going to read this manga book today and work on my review tomorrow. And I'm going to be working hard for doing this video as fast as I can, I guess. So it is a wonderful introduction to databases. Yet, mind you, you may be surprised of what you can actually learn from a 10-year-old manga book about databases. Do not make my mistake by underestimating what you can actually learn from this manga. I think years after I got this book, I lost it. I got a physical copy, and years pass, and moving from one home to another, I lost the physical copy I have at the time. And I never cared to find it again until recently, because I just opened an old box from 10 years ago, and all these memories came back to me. So it's a really cute little book that I do recommend you. Even if you are an expert database administrator, I do recommend you to give it a look, give it a chance, and you are not going to be disappointed. It's a very fun plot. The characters are simple-minded, maybe, but the thing is that I identify with the princess a lot, because a lot of things are happening around her. There is a love interest on one side. There is the people in her kingdom that depend on her decisions. And suddenly, she begins working with databases, and everything seems to run so easy and smoothly. But this happens because she took the time to create a database to manage all the data in the kingdom. And that's why people now have the data and the information they need. And it's so simple once it already exists. It's just like picking up your phone, pushing a button, and write down a message and send it. We take that for granted today. The truth is that developing even a single chat software, if you had never done something like it, it's going to be very hard, actually. So when the people on the kingdom see all this, they assume that the princess is so smart, is so capable, and she just sacrificed too much to be able to do something that seems so simple. And that's what I identify with her, basically. So who knows? I guess I wonder how much time I've been talking about. I always lost that I'm lost on my own speech, I guess. I guess I'm one of those persons that loves the sound of his own voice, maybe. Well, thank you for coming, and I hope to see you later. And remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, give it a like and get a click on the notification bell so you can actually get a notification when I release the actual video review for the manga guide to databases. Thank you for coming in, and goodbye.